alone in the Siberian wilderness, fighting cold, wolves, and killers. The plane shuddered like a dying animal. Dr. Mikhail Volkov pressed his face against the small window, watching the endless white expanse of Siberia blur past below. Snow swirled in thick curtains, and the aircraft bucked against winds that seemed determined to tear it apart. He'd flown this route dozens of times for his geological surveys, but tonight felt different. Wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Captain Alexei Ruzanov's voice crackled through the intercom, but Misha caught the tremor beneath the professional calm. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Across the aisle, Elena Kozlova clutched her laptop bag like a lifeline. The journalist had been nervous since boarding in Moscow, constantly checking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound. During takeoff, she'd slipped Misha a business card with a phone number scrawled on the back. If something happens to me, she'd whispered, call this number. Tell them about Project Tungsten. Misha had pocketed the card, thinking it was paranoia. Now, as the plane lurched violently to the left, he wondered if Elena knew something he didn't. 3 rows ahead, Viktor Petrov ended another hushed phone call. The mining executive had been on his phone constantly, speaking in rapid Russian about schedules and problems being solved. His knuckles were white as he gripped the armrest. The flight attendant, Dmitry Semenov, moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, but Misha noticed how his eyes lingered on Elena. Too long. Too intense. Misha. Elena leaned across the aisle, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. I need you to know. The world exploded. A deafening roar filled the cabin. The plane's nose dipped sharply, and Misha's stomach lurched into his throat. Through the chaos of screaming passengers and falling luggage, he glimpsed Elena's face. Not surprise, but grim confirmation, as if she'd been expecting this moment. The aircraft spiraled downward. Oxygen masks dropped like hangmen. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the emergency strips along the floor. In the eerie red glow, Misha saw Dmitry moving with purpose toward the cockpit, not helping passengers but clutching something in his hand. Elena, Misha shouted, but his words were swallowed by the screaming wind now pouring through a crack in the fuselage. The last thing he remembered was her eyes, determined, unafraid, as she pressed something into his jacket pocket. Then the forest rushed up to meet them, and the world went black. Cold. The first sensation that broke through the fog of unconsciousness was bone-deep, soul-stealing cold. Misha's eyes opened to a world painted in shades of white and gray. Snow fell steadily through the jagged tear in the aircraft's roof above him. He was alive. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was alive, and the silence around him was absolute. No moaning. No calls for help. No sounds of other survivors. Misha tried to move and gasped as pain shot through his left shoulder. Dislocated, but not broken. His geological training kicked in, assessed the situation, prioritized threats, survive. He'd spent years in remote locations, had survival training, understood the hostile environment better than most. But understanding and surviving were different things. The cabin section he occupied had broken away from the main fuselage during impact. Bodies hung at unnatural angles in their seats, covered by a growing blanket of snow. Misha forced himself to look at each face, hoping against hope to find another survivor. Elena sat 2 rows ahead, her head tilted at an angle that needed no medical expertise to interpret. Her laptop bag was gone, but whatever she'd pressed into his pocket was still there, a small encrypted USB drive. I'm sorry, he whispered to her still form. I'm so sorry. Viktor Petrov had been thrown from his seat. His expensive suit was torn, revealing the soft flesh of a man who'd never known real hardship. His phone lay shattered beside him, its screen spiderwebbed but still glowing with an unsent message. Package delivered. Confirm payment. Misha's blood chilled. Package delivered. The words echoed in his mind as he struggled to free himself from his seat. The crash hadn't been an accident. Someone had wanted Elena dead, and they'd been willing to kill everyone on board to do it. Moving carefully, Misha gathered what he could from the wreckage. A survival kit from under his seat, airline standard, mostly useless. Elena's heavy winter coat, which fit him better than his own torn jacket. Some protein bars from the galley. A small first aid kit. Most importantly, he found Captain Ruzanov's flight bag wedged under a seat. Inside was a handheld GPS unit, a detailed map of the region, and a small digital recorder. The recorder was damaged but functional. Misha pocketed it along with the GPS. The temperature was dropping fast. In this region, at this time of year, nighttime temperatures could reach -40 Celsius. Without shelter, he'd be dead within hours. But first, he had to know where he was. The GPS showed his location as approximately 180 kilometers northeast of Yakutsk. The nearest settlement was a tiny village called Oymyakon, roughly 200 kilometers to the southwest. In good weather, with proper equipment, it would be a challenging but manageable trek. In a blizzard, injured and alone, it was nearly impossible. Nearly. Misha had grown up in Novosibirsk before his family emigrated to Canada. He spoke the language, understood the culture, knew the land. More importantly, he'd spent the last 15 years studying this exact region for mineral surveys. He knew there were abandoned Soviet weather stations scattered throughout the area, and one of them was less than 30 kilometers away. If he could reach it, he might survive long enough to be rescued. As he prepared to leave the wreckage, Misha took one last look at Elena. In death, her face held a strange peace, as if she'd accepted her fate long before the plane went down. He made a silent promise to her. If he survived, he'd find out who did this and why. The storm was getting worse. Time to move. The wind cut through Misha's layers like sharpened ice. Each step forward was a victory against the elements and his own body's rebellion. His shoulder throbbed, his head pounded, and frostbite was already claiming the tips of his fingers despite his gloves. But he was alive, and that meant something. The forest around the crash site was thick with pine and birch, their branches heavy with snow. Misha used them as guides, following game trails that led generally southwest. His geological training had taught him to read landscapes, to see the subtle signs that others missed. A deer path here, a natural windbreak there, small advantages that might mean the difference between life and death. After 2 hours of walking, he stopped to rest against a fallen log. His breath formed ice crystals in the air, and his beard was already collecting frost. The GPS showed he'd covered maybe 3 kilometers. At this rate, it would take him 10 days to reach the weather station. He didn't have 10 days. As he sat in the growing darkness, Misha's mind wandered back to the flight. He'd been returning from a survey of rare earth deposits near Magadan when Elena approached him at the airport. She'd seemed to know exactly who he was, had specifically sought him out. "Dr. Volkov," she'd said, settling into the seat beside him at the gate. "I'm Elena Kozlova from Moscow Tribune. I wonder if we might talk about your work in the region." "I don't give interviews," he'd replied, not looking up from his geological survey reports. "Not about your research. About the mining operations you've been documenting." That had gotten his attention. His surveys were classified, part of a joint Canadian-Russian project to map mineral resources. The public shouldn't know about them. "I think you have me confused with someone else," he'd said carefully. Elena had smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Project Tungsten, Dr. Volkov. The illegal extraction operations your surveys have been inadvertently documenting. The environmental damage. The cover-up." The name meant nothing to him then. Now, trudging through the snow with her USB drive in his pocket, he wondered what secrets had died with her. A wolf howled in the distance, the sound echoing off the trees. Then another answered, closer. Misha's survival instincts kicked in fully. Wolves in this region traveled in packs, and they were skilled hunters. Alone, injured human would be easy prey. He forced himself to his feet and continued walking. The GPS showed a small stream about a kilometer ahead. If he could follow it, it would lead him toward higher ground and potentially to one of the old survey markers he'd placed years ago. The snow was getting deeper. Each step required more effort, and his body was burning through energy reserves at an alarming rate. Misha knew the signs of hypothermia, confusion, drowsiness, slurred speech. He wasn't there yet, but he was close. The stream, when he finally reached it, was partially frozen. The sound of running water was almost musical after hours of trudging through silent snow. Misha knelt carefully and drank, the ice-cold water shocking his system but providing necessary hydration. As he stood, something caught his eye. Footprints in the snow beside the stream. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Recent ones. Someone else had survived the crash. Hope flared in his chest. He wasn't alone. He followed the tracks for several hundred meters before they ended abruptly at a cluster of rocks. Looking closer, Misha saw dark stains in the snow. Blood. A body lay wedged between two boulders. Dmitry Semenov, the flight attendant, but he hadn't died in the crash. His injuries were different. A deep wound to the back of his head, and his hands were torn as if he'd fought for his life. In his jacket pocket, Misha found a small device that looked like a detonator. His blood ran cold as the implications hit him. Dmitry hadn't just been a flight attendant. He'd been the one who brought down the plane. But someone had killed him after the crash. Someone who knew what he'd done. The wolf howl came again, much closer now. Misha pocketed the detonator and moved away from the body. He needed shelter, warmth, and time to think. But first, he needed to survive the night. As darkness fell completely, he found a small cave formed by fallen rocks. It wasn't much, but it would block the wind. He gathered what dry wood he could find and managed to start a small fire using emergency matches from the survival kit. The flames danced against the rock walls, casting weird shadows that seemed to move independently. Misha huddled close to the fire, trying to process what he'd learned. The crash was murder. Elena had been the target. Dmitry had been the killer. But who had killed Dmitry? And why? The questions swirled in his mind as exhaustion finally claimed him. His last thought before sleep was of Elena's eyes, determined, unafraid, as she'd pressed the USB drive into his pocket. She'd known she was going to die. The question was, what had she wanted him to do about it? Misha woke to the sound of his own chattering teeth. The fire had died to embers, and frost covered everything in the small cave, including his sleeping bag. Outside, the storm had intensified. Snow fell in thick sheets, driven by winds that howled like banshees. Day 2. His body was stiff, his shoulder worse than yesterday, and his water supplies were running low. But he was alive. He forced himself to eat one of the protein bars, though it tasted like cardboard. Nutrition was fuel, and fuel was life. He couldn't afford to be picky. The GPS showed his location, but the weather station was still 25 kilometers away. In this storm, visibility was maybe 10 meters. He'd have to navigate by compass and instinct, following the stream when possible. Before leaving the cave, Misha examined the detonator he'd found on Dmitry's body. It was sophisticated, military-grade equipment. This wasn't some amateur operation. Someone with serious resources had wanted Elena dead. But why? What had she discovered about Project Tungsten that was worth killing for? He packed his meager supplies and stepped back into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he wondered if he should just stay in the cave. At least he'd die warm. No. Elena had trusted him with something important. He owed it to her and to the other passengers who died to find out what. The stream was his lifeline. Even when he couldn't see it through the snow, he could hear the water moving beneath the ice. It led him generally in the right direction, toward higher ground where the weather station waited. As he walked, Misha's mind wandered back to his conversation with Elena during the flight. She'd been nervous, constantly checking her phone and looking around the cabin. But she'd also been determined, almost excited. "I've been investigating this for 6 months, she told him in a whisper. "It's bigger than just illegal mining. They're destroying entire ecosystems, bribing government officials, even killing people who get too close to the truth." "Who's they?" he'd asked. "Oleg Marchenko and his associates. They're using legitimate mining surveys, like yours, to identify valuable deposits, then moving in with illegal operations before the proper permits can be filed." The name Marchenko was familiar. He was a Russian oligarch with interests in mining, shipping, and construction. Rich enough to buy politicians, powerful enough to eliminate problems, rich enough to sabotage a plane. Misha's reverie was interrupted by movement in the trees ahead. Through the swirling snow, he glimpsed gray shapes moving parallel to his path. Wolves. At least 3 of them, maybe more. He stopped walking and assessed the situation. The wolves were keeping their distance, but they were definitely following him. In this weather, they'd be as desperate for food as he was. A weakened human would be an easy target. But Misha had advantages. He knew the terrain, understood predator behavior, and had fire. Wolves were afraid of fire. He gathered some dry branches and used his lighter to create a torch. The flames sputtered in the wind but held. The wolves stopped moving, yellow eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not today," Misha muttered, waving the torch in their direction. "Find someone else to eat." The standoff lasted several minutes before the wolves melted back into the forest. Misha knew they'd return, probably during the night when he was more vulnerable. He needed to reach better shelter before dark. The stream led him up a gradual slope, the terrain becoming rockier. His geological training told him he was approaching the foothills of the Shersky Mountains. The weather station was somewhere in this area, built during the Soviet era to monitor conditions in the remote wilderness. As the day wore on, Misha's condition deteriorated. His fingers were numb despite his gloves, and his feet felt like blocks of ice. The early signs of frostbite were appearing, white, waxy patches on his cheeks and nose. But he kept moving. Movement was life. Near sunset, he found what he was looking for, a concrete foundation partially hidden by snow and overgrown vegetation. The weather station. Most of the building was gone, destroyed by decades of harsh weather, but the underground sections remained intact. Misha cleared snow from a metal hatch and pried it open. A ladder descended into darkness. The air below was cold but still, protected from the wind. He could smell old metal and decay, but no signs of animals. It would do. He climbed down into the abandoned station, his torch illuminating a small room filled with rusted equipment and scattered papers. Most importantly, there was a ventilation shaft that could serve as a chimney for a fire and enough debris to burn for several days. As he set up his camp, Misha found something unexpected among the scattered papers, a logbook from the station's final days of operation. The entries were in Russian, dated 30 years ago, but they told a story of increasing isolation, equipment failures, and growing desperation. The final entry was haunting. "Radio is dead. Supply drop never came. If anyone finds this, we tried to walk out. God help us all." Misha wondered if he was destined to leave a similar message. Then he pushed the thought away. Elena had died trusting him with something important. He wouldn't let her down by giving up. He built a fire in the center of the room and settled in for the night. The flames cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls, and for the first time in 2 days, he felt almost warm. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, he knew the wolves were waiting. The fire crackled steadily, filling the abandoned station with warmth and light. Misha had found enough combustible material to last several days. Old papers, wooden furniture, even some coal left behind by the station's final crew. For the first time since the crash, he felt secure enough to rest properly. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face in those final moments. The way she'd looked at him, not with fear but with desperate urgency. She'd known the plane was going down, had been expecting it, and she'd trusted him with whatever was on that USB drive. Misha pulled the device from his pocket and examined it in the firelight. It was encrypted, military-grade security. Without the right computer and password, it might as well be a piece of plastic. But Elena had given it to him for a reason. "Tell them about Project Tungsten," she'd whispered at the airport. But tell who? And what exactly was Project Tungsten? He'd been so focused on survival that he hadn't had time to properly process what he'd learned. Dmitri had sabotaged the plane, but someone had killed him after the crash. That meant there was another player in this game, someone who'd also survived the crash and tracked down the saboteur. The thought was both hopeful and terrifying. If someone else had survived, Misha wasn't alone. But if that person was willing to kill Dmitri in cold blood, they might not be friendly to the only witness. A sound from above made him freeze. Footsteps on the metal hatch. Slow, deliberate, human. Misha grabbed a piece of burning wood from the fire and stood quietly. The footsteps circled the hatch, then stopped. After a long moment, they moved away. Someone was up there. Someone who knew he was down here. Misha waited an hour before climbing up to investigate. The hatch was covered with fresh snow, but he could see tracks leading away from the station. Large boots, probably a man's. The tracks led into the forest and disappeared. Back underground, Misha tried to make sense of what he'd learned. 3 days ago, he'd been a geologist on a routine flight home. Now he was alone in the Siberian wilderness, carrying evidence of a conspiracy that had killed at least 50 people. But what kind of conspiracy? Elena had mentioned environmental damage and government corruption, but that hardly seemed worth mass murder. There had to be something more. He thought back to his conversation with Viktor Petrov at the airport. The mining executive had been nervous, constantly on his phone. During the flight, Misha had overheard fragments of his conversations. "The shipment is secured. No complications. The problem will be solved." Elena had been the problem. Her investigation into Project Tungsten had threatened something big enough to justify sabotaging a commercial airliner. Misha fed more wood to the fire and settled in for a long night. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the land. Inside, he was warm and relatively safe. But he knew this was temporary. Eventually, he'd have to venture back into the cold and continue his journey to civilization. The question was, would he live long enough to tell anyone what he'd learned? As if summoned by his thoughts, the wolves began to howl. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, a haunting reminder that he wasn't the only predator in this wilderness. But predators, Misha reflected, came in many forms. Some had 4 legs and fangs. Others wore expensive suits and carried briefcases full of money. Both were dangerous. Both were hungry. And both were hunting him. Day 3 dawned gray and bitter. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by fresh snow. Misha climbed from the underground station into a world that sparkled with deadly beauty. The temperature had dropped even further. The GPS showed -38°C. At this temperature, exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Every breath was a painful reminder of how hostile this environment was to human life. But the clear skies meant he could navigate properly, and the weather station had provided him with crucial supplies. Among the debris, He'd found an old Soviet-era radio transmitter. It was damaged but might be reparable. He'd also discovered a cache of emergency flares and a detailed topographical map of the region. Most importantly, he'd found evidence that the station had been used recently: fresh batteries, modern food wrappers, recent entries in what appeared to be a logbook. Someone had been using this place as a base of operations. Misha packed his supplies and prepared to leave. The nearest settlement was still 170 kilometers away, but he'd identified a series of waypoints that would help him navigate: an abandoned mining camp, a river crossing, another weather station. Each represented a potential shelter and a step closer to safety. But first, he had to deal with the wolves. The pack had grown bolder during the night. Misha counted at least 5 sets of tracks circling the station. They were waiting for him to leave his shelter, and in this cold, they wouldn't wait long. He'd learned about wolf behavior during his geological surveys. They were intelligent predators, capable of complex pack tactics, but they were also creatures of habit, and they had weaknesses. Misha lit 3 emergency flares and spaced them around the station entrance. The bright red flames and acrid smoke would confuse the wolves' senses and mark his position if any aircraft were searching for survivors. Then he set off toward the southwest, following a ridge line that would give him good visibility. The wolves followed, staying just beyond the range of his improvised torch. They were patient, professional. Misha began to understand how prey animals felt: constantly watched, constantly evaluated, waiting for the moment when weakness would invite attack. But he wasn't just prey. He was a human being with intelligence, tools, and the accumulated knowledge of his species. That had to count for something. The morning passed in a strange dance of hunter and hunted. Misha maintained his course, stopping frequently to rest and eat. The wolves shadowed him, never getting closer than 50 meters but never falling behind. It was like being escorted by death itself. Around noon, he reached the abandoned mining camp he'd identified on the map. The buildings were mostly collapsed, but there were still metal structures that could provide shelter. More importantly, there were signs of recent human activity. Vehicle tracks in the snow, though they were partially filled by the storm. Fresh tire marks on the access road. A generator that was still warm to the touch. Someone had been here within the last day or two. Misha explored the camp carefully, his senses alert for any sign of danger. In the main office building, he found something that made his blood run cold: a detailed map of the region with the crash site marked in red. Flight path calculations, weather data, rescue operation timelines. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been planning for the crash, preparing for the aftermath. In a desk drawer, he found a satellite phone. Dead battery, but it might work if he could find a power source. He also found a laptop computer, also dead, but it had ports that might accept Elena's USB drive. The most disturbing discovery was a folder labeled Project Tungsten Phase 3. Inside were photographs of mineral deposits, environmental damage reports, and a list of names. Elena Kozlova was on the list, with a red line drawn through it. So was Dr. Anya Petrov, an environmental scientist, and Dr. James Mitchell, a geology professor. All 3 had been researching the same region. All 3 had been asking difficult questions about mining operations and environmental damage. Misha's name wasn't on the list, but he realized that was only because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elena had been the target, and everyone else on the plane had been collateral damage. But who was behind Project Tungsten? And why were they willing to kill scientists and journalists to protect it? The answer came in the form of a letterhead at the bottom of one document: Marchenko Industries. The oligarch Elena had mentioned. The man with enough money and power to make problems disappear. A sound from outside made Misha freeze. An engine, getting closer. He grabbed the satellite phone and the Project Tungsten folder, then slipped out the back of the building. A snowmobile was approaching the camp, its rider bundled in heavy winter gear. Misha hid behind a collapsed wall and watched as the figure dismounted and began searching the buildings. The rider moved with military precision, checking each structure methodically. When the figure entered the office building, Misha heard a curse in Russian. The rider had discovered that someone had been there, had found the documents. Misha used the distraction to move closer to the snowmobile. If he could steal it, he could reach civilization in hours instead of days. But as he approached, he realized the machine was locked and would require a key to start. The rider emerged from the building, and Misha got his first clear look at the face. It was a woman, maybe 40 years old, with the hard features of someone who'd spent years in harsh conditions. She carried a military-style rifle and moved with the confidence of a trained soldier. She was also looking directly at him. "Dr. Volkov," she called out in accented English. "I know you're there. We need to talk." Misha remained hidden, his mind racing. How did she know his name? Was she working for Marchenko? Or was she something else entirely? "I'm not going to hurt you," the woman continued. "My name is Mikhail Volkov. I'm your sister." The words hit Misha like a physical blow. Katia, his little sister, who'd been 15 when the family emigrated to Canada, who'd stayed behind to attend university in Moscow, who'd joined the Russian military and disappeared into the world of intelligence and state security. He hadn't seen her in over 20 years. "I know it's hard to believe," Katia said, lowering her rifle slightly, "but I'm here to help. Elena Kozlova was my asset. She was working for us, investigating Marchenko's operations. When her plane went down, I was sent to find survivors and recover her intelligence." Misha stepped out from behind the wall, his hands visible but ready to dive for cover. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Katia smiled, and for a moment, he saw the little girl he'd once known. "Because you used to call me Katyusha. And you were the one who taught me to read English using comic books about superheroes." The childhood memory was so specific, so personal, that Misha felt his suspicions begin to crumble. "Katia." "Hello, big brother," she said. "Now let's get you out of here before Marchenko's people find us both." As if summoned by her words, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley. Multiple aircraft, approaching fast. "Too late," Katia muttered, shouldering her rifle. "Looks like we're going to have to fight our way out." The helicopters appeared over the ridge like mechanical vultures, their rotors churning the snow into blinding clouds. Misha counted 3 aircraft, military style, painted in civilian colors but obviously modified for combat. "This way," Katia shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a cluster of metal storage tanks. "We need cover." They dove behind the tanks just as the first helicopter opened fire. Bullets sparked off metal and concrete, sending fragments of debris flying. Misha pressed himself against the cold steel, his heart hammering. "Who are they?" he yelled over the noise. "Marchenko's cleanup crew," Katia replied, checking her rifle. "They're here to eliminate witnesses and recover Elena's intelligence." Another burst of gunfire, closer this time. One of the helicopters was landing while the others provided cover. Misha could hear boots hitting the ground, voices shouting in Russian. "How many?" he asked. "Too many. Maybe a dozen, plus the air support." Katia's face was grim. "But they won't expect us to fight back. Most crash survivors would be half dead by now." "I am half dead," Misha pointed out. "Then we'll have to be smart instead of strong." Katia pulled a small device from her pack. "Emergency beacon. If I activate this, it'll bring help, but it'll also give away our position." The sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for them. Katia activated the beacon and immediately began moving, leading Misha through the maze of collapsed buildings. Behind them, the storage tanks erupted in flames as the helicopters concentrated their fire. "There!" A voice shouted in Russian. 2 figures, moving south. Katia spun and fired 3 quick shots. A scream echoed across the camp, followed by angry shouts. They'd drawn blood, but it would only make the hunters more determined. The mine shaft, Katia said, pointing to a concrete structure built into the hillside. If we can reach it, we can get underground. They ran, slipping and sliding in the snow. Bullets whined around them, chipping concrete and gouging the frozen ground. Misha's lungs burned in the cold air, and his injured shoulder screamed with each movement. A helicopter swooped low, its door gunner tracking them with a mounted weapon. Katia dove left, pulling Misha with her, just as the hillside erupted in a line of explosions. "Roll," she shouted. They tumbled down the slope, using the terrain to break the helicopter's line of sight. Misha's world became a blur of snow, rock, and sky. He hit something hard and came to a stop against a fallen tree. Katia landed beside him, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "You okay?" "Still breathing," Misha gasped. "Then we keep moving." The mine shaft entrance was 50 meters away, but it might as well have been 50 kilometers. The helicopters had adjusted their position, and ground forces were closing in from multiple directions. Misha could see muzzle flashes in the trees, hear the whistle of bullets passing overhead. "Give me the USB drive," Katia said. "What?" "Elena's drive. If we don't make it, the intelligence has to survive." Misha hesitated. The drive was his only connection to Elena, his only chance to honor her sacrifice. But Katia was right. The information was more important than his personal feelings. He handed over the drive, and Katia immediately activated another device, a small transmitter that would upload the data to a satellite network. "Insurance policy," she explained. "Now, even if they kill us, Elena's work will survive." The transmission took 30 seconds. In that time, the enemy forces closed to within 20 meters. Misha could see individual faces, determined professionals who'd been hired to eliminate a problem. "Time to go," Katia said, shouldering her rifle again. They burst from cover, running straight at the mine shaft. The ground forces opened fire, but their shots were rushed, inaccurate. Misha felt the wind of bullets passing close enough to touch, but somehow none found their mark. 10 meters. 5. The mine shaft entrance loomed ahead like salvation. A helicopter appeared directly overhead, its door gunner tracking them with mechanical precision. Misha saw the muzzle flash, felt the impact as bullets chewed up the ground around his feet. Then they were through the entrance, diving into the darkness beyond. The shaft angled downward, following a vein of ore that had been mined decades ago. The concrete gave way to rough rock walls, and the temperature dropped even further. But they were alive, and for the moment, they were safe. "They'll follow us," Katia said, breathing hard. "But underground, their numbers don't matter as much. We can hold them off." "For how long?" "Long enough." She checked her watch. "Help is coming, but it'll be at least an hour." They moved deeper into the mine, using flashlights to navigate the network of tunnels. The air was stale and cold, but at least they were protected from the wind. Misha's geological training helped him understand the layout. This had been a copper mine, probably operational until the 1980s. Behind them, lights appeared in the main tunnel. Their pursuers had entered the mine. "Here," Katia said, pointing to a side passage. "We can set up a choke point." They positioned themselves where the tunnel narrowed, giving them clear fields of fire while limiting the enemy's ability to outflank them. Katia distributed ammunition from her pack. She'd come prepared for a fight. "How did you know I was alive?" Misha asked as they waited. "I didn't. I was sent to recover Elena's body and any intelligence she might have left behind. Finding you was unexpected, but not unwelcome." Katia smiled grimly. "You're my brother. That counts for something, even in this business." The first enemy soldier appeared at the tunnel entrance, moving carefully with a tactical light. Kadia's rifle barked once, and the light went out. Shouts echoed through the mine as the assault team regrouped. Professional, Kadia observed. But they're not used to underground fighting. The next attack came from two directions simultaneously. Misha heard boots on stone, saw lights playing across the tunnel walls. He fired his improvised weapon, a flare gun loaded with an emergency signal, and was rewarded with a scream as the burning projectile found its target. But there were too many of them. For every attacker they stopped, two more appeared. The enemy was using superior numbers to overwhelm their position. "We need to move," Kadia said, ejecting an empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one. "They're going to flank us." They retreated deeper into the mine, using their flashlights sparingly to avoid giving away their position. The tunnels branched and intersected in a maze that would have been confusing to anyone unfamiliar with mining operations. But Misha's geological training helped him navigate, following the natural flow of the ore veins. "There should be another exit," he said, studying the tunnel layout. These old Soviet mines always had multiple access points. "Find it," Kadia replied, covering their rear. "We're running out of ammunition." They moved through the darkness, the sound of their pursuers echoing behind them. Misha's mind worked frantically, trying to remember everything he knew about mining operations in this region. The geology was complex, multiple ore bodies, fractured rock, underground streams that could flood sections of the mine. That gave him an idea. "This way," he said, leading Kadia toward a section where he could hear water flowing. "There's a sump pump system. If we can disable it." "Flood the mine," Kadia finished. "Clever. But we need to make sure we have an exit route first." They found the pump station in a chamber carved from solid rock. The Soviet-era equipment was still functional, maintained by automated systems that continued to operate decades after the mine's closure. Misha studied the controls, identifying the key components. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "I can redirect the water flow to flood the main tunnels." "You've got 2 minutes," Kadia replied, taking position at the chamber entrance. "They're getting closer." Misha worked frantically, using his geological knowledge to understand the mine's drainage system. The pumps were designed to handle normal groundwater seepage, but if he could redirect the flow from the underground stream. Gunfire erupted in the tunnel outside. Kadia's rifle answered, followed by the sound of someone falling. But there were more voices, more lights approaching. "Misha!" Almost there. He threw a series of switches, and the sound of the pumps changed. Instead of removing water from the mine, they were now flooding it. "Done. Let's go." They ran through the chamber's rear exit just as water began pouring into the tunnel behind them. The sound of rushing water mixed with shouts of alarm as their pursuers realized what was happening. The exit tunnel angled upward, following a natural fissure in the rock. Misha's lungs burned as they climbed, but he could see daylight ahead. They were going to make it. They emerged onto a rocky outcrop overlooking the mining camp. Below, the helicopters were still circling, but their crews were focused on the flooded mine entrance. Smoke rose from the storage tanks, and the ground was littered with the debris of battle. "There," Kadia pointed to a distant ridge. "That's where help will come from." As if summoned by her words, Misha heard the sound of approaching aircraft, different from the helicopters, higher-pitched, faster. "Military jets." "Russian Air Force," Kadia explained. "I called in some favors." The jets screamed over the valley, their presence immediately changing the tactical situation. The helicopters broke off their search and began retreating, unwilling to face military opposition. "It's over," Misha said, hardly believing it. "This part is," Kadia replied. "But the real work is just beginning." Elena's intelligence is already being analyzed. Marchenko's operation is about to be exposed. They watched the helicopters disappear beyond the horizon, taking with them the immediate threat of death. But Misha knew that the conspiracy Elena had died to expose was still out there, still dangerous. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we go home," Claudia said. "And we make sure Elena's sacrifice wasn't in vain." The debriefing took place in a sterile conference room in Moscow, 3 weeks after the rescue. Misha sat across from a panel of investigators, intelligence officers, prosecutors, and officials from multiple agencies. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. It was a stark contrast to the Siberian wilderness, but in some ways, it felt just as hostile. Dr. Volkov, the lead investigator, began, "Thank you for your cooperation. Your testimony has been invaluable in our investigation of what we're calling the tungsten conspiracy." Misha nodded, though he still felt disconnected from the proceedings. Part of him was still in the forest, still fighting for survival, still carrying Elena's USB drive in his pocket. The warm room and formal procedures felt surreal. "The evidence you recovered has led to the arrest of 17 individuals," the investigator continued, "including Oleg Marchenko himself." The name still sent a chill through Misha. He'd seen photographs of the Oligarch during the investigation, a soft-faced man in expensive suits who looked more like a banker than a mass murderer. But the evidence was overwhelming. Marchenko had orchestrated the destruction of Flight 447 to eliminate Elena Kozlova and prevent the exposure of his illegal mining operations. "Elena's investigation was more thorough than we initially realized," another official added. "She documented not just the environmental damage, but the entire network of corruption that made it possible. Government officials, mining executives, even some military personnel." "How many people died because of this?" Misha asked. 53 on the plane. At least a dozen others over the past 2 years. Scientists, journalists, environmental activists. Anyone who got too close to the truth. The number hit Misha like a physical blow. 53 innocent people murdered because they'd been on the wrong flight at the wrong time. Their only crime had been sharing an aircraft with Elena Kozlova. Project Tungsten was Marchenko's code name for his illegal rare earth mining operations, the investigator explained. He was using legitimate geological surveys to identify valuable deposits, then moving in with unlicensed extraction before proper environmental assessments could be conducted. "The environmental damage was catastrophic," another official added. "Entire river systems contaminated. Wildlife populations destroyed. Indigenous communities displaced from their traditional lands." Misha thought about the landscape he'd trekked through, the pristine wilderness that had nearly killed him. It was hard to imagine it poisoned by industrial waste, but he'd seen enough mining operations to understand the potential for destruction. "What about the other survivors?" he asked. "The person who killed Dmitry Semenov?" "There were no other survivors," the investigator replied. "The forensics team determined that Semenov's injuries were consistent with trauma from the crash, not murder. His body was simply moved by scavengers. Wolves, most likely." Misha frowned. He'd been certain that someone else had survived, had killed the saboteur. But the investigators were confident in their conclusions, and he was beginning to doubt his own memories of those traumatic days. "What about Captain Ruzanov?" he asked. His flight recorder showed course deviations. "The captain was coerced," the investigator explained. "Marchenko's people threatened his family, forced him to deviate from the planned route to ensure maximum casualties when the bomb detonated. The captain died believing he was protecting his children. The tragedy of it all was overwhelming. Captain Ruzanov had been a victim too, forced to participate in mass murder to save his family. The corruption had reached into every aspect of the operation, twisting good people into unwilling accomplices. The important thing is that Elena's work will have lasting impact," the investigator concluded. "The mining sites have been shut down, the environmental damage is being addressed, and the legal proceedings will ensure that justice is served. Justice. The word felt hollow to Misha. Elena was still dead. The passengers of Flight 447 were still dead. All the prosecution and prison sentences in the world wouldn't bring them back. But it would prevent future tragedies. Other journalists and scientists would be safer because Elena had been brave enough to investigate the truth, and because she'd trusted him to carry that truth to safety. After the debriefing, Misha met with Katya in a small cafe near the government building. She looked tired but satisfied, like a soldier who'd completed a difficult mission. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Still processing everything," Misha admitted. "Part of me is still in that forest, still trying to survive." "That's normal. It takes time to readjust to civilization after something like that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Moscow traffic through the cafe window. The city was busy, alive, completely removed from the deadly wilderness where they'd fought for their lives. "I keep thinking about Elena," Misha said finally. "She knew she was going to die, but she did it anyway. She could have backed down, could have stopped investigating, but she chose to see it through." "She was a brave woman," Katya agreed. "And she chose well when she trusted you with her evidence." "I almost didn't make it. If you hadn't found me. But you did make it. And Elena's work will have lasting impact because of your courage." Misha wasn't sure he felt courageous. He'd simply done what was necessary to survive, to honor the trust Elena had placed in him. But maybe that was what courage really was, doing what needed to be done, even when you were scared. "What happens now?" he asked. "Do you go back to your intelligence work?" Katya smiled. "I've actually been offered a position with the Environmental Crimes Unit. It seems my experience with the tungsten case makes me valuable for investigating similar operations. And I'll go back to my geological surveys," Misha said. "But I think I'll be more careful about what I'm documenting, more aware of how my work might be used." "Elena would approve of that," Katya said. She believed that scientists had a responsibility to consider the implications of their work. As they prepared to leave, Misha thought about the weeks ahead. He would return to Canada, to his university position and his research. But he would also carry with him the memory of Elena's sacrifice, the knowledge that science and journalism could be dangerous professions when they threatened powerful interests. The Siberian wilderness had nearly killed him, but it had also taught him something important. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about preserving what mattered, about ensuring that truth could survive even when the people who discovered it could not. Elena Kozlova had died in the frozen wilderness, but her work would live on, and Misha would make sure that her sacrifice was never forgotten. 1 year later, Misha stood in the small cemetery outside Yakutsk, reading the names carved into the granite memorial. 53 passengers and crew members, their names etched in stone beneath a simple inscription. They died seeking truth. The memorial had been Elena's idea, mentioned in her final notes. She'd wanted to ensure that if anything happened to her, the other victims wouldn't be forgotten. The crash had been front-page news for a week, but Elena knew that public attention was fleeting. The memorial would endure. "Dr. Volkov?" A young woman approached him, holding a tape recorder. "I'm Svetlana Petrov from Moscow Tribune. I'm working on a follow-up story about the tungsten case. Would you be willing to speak with me?" Misha studied her face, seeing something of Elena in her determined expression. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know about Elena. Not just her investigation, but who she was as a person. The public sees her as a symbol, but I want to tell them about the woman who risked everything for the truth. Elena was." Misha paused, choosing his words carefully. She was someone who understood that some things are more important than survival. She knew the cost of her investigation, but she believed the truth was worth any sacrifice. "Do you think she would be satisfied with the outcome?" Marchenko's conviction, the mining operations shut down, the environmental restoration efforts. Misha considered the question. I think she would be pleased that the truth came out. But she would also know that this was just one battle in a larger war. There are other oligarchs, other conspiracies, other people who need to be held accountable. And that's why journalists like you are continuing her work? Like me. Svetlana smiled. I'm following the same leads Elena was investigating when she died. There are indications that the tungsten operation was just one part of a larger network of corruption and environmental crime. The word sent a chill through Misha. He'd hoped that Elena's sacrifice had ended the conspiracy, but it seemed the corruption ran deeper than anyone had realized. Be careful, he said. The people behind this have killed before. They won't hesitate to kill again. I know the risks, Svetlana replied. But Elena showed us that some stories are worth dying for. I just hope I have her courage when the time comes. As the young journalist walked away, Misha thought about the cycle of truth and sacrifice, the way one person's courage could inspire others to take up the fight. Elena was gone, but her work continued through people like Svetlana, through prosecutors and investigators, through scientists who were more careful about how their research was used. The Siberian wilderness had taught him that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about preserving what mattered, about ensuring that truth could survive even when the people who discovered it could not. Elena Kozlova had died in the frozen wilderness, but her legacy would endure, and Misha would make sure that her sacrifice was never forgotten. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the distant mountains. Winter was coming again, but Misha was no longer afraid of the cold. He had survived the worst that nature could offer, and he had learned that the human spirit was stronger than any storm. As he walked away from the memorial, Misha thought about the USB drive that had started it all. The device was now in the hands of investigators, its secrets revealed, its purpose fulfilled. But the real legacy of Elena's sacrifice wasn't in the data she'd collected. It was in the courage she'd shown, the trust she'd placed in a stranger, and the truth she'd died to protect. Some things Misha had learned were worth freezing for. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.